had a very beautiful community. Let's try to ground ourselves a little bit about what's going on in Iran and how the world might respond. I apologize, I'm seemingly in the early stages of COVID number 3, and that's why I've been away for a couple of days. But I think, even though I'm going to be slower and a little bit tipsy all over the place, I hope to be able to ground you a little bit in this conversation. I'm certainly going to really give it a go. So let's strap ourselves in and try. It's very important that I am not an Iran country expert. Now, in a way, I am not a Russia country expert either, but contingently, my knowledge of Russia is commensurate with the knowledge of country experts. In some ways, it's shallower, in other ways, it's actually deeper. Obviously, that's not true about Iran. So I'm speaking to you as an incredibly minor public intellectual who is going to give you some frames rather than deep country insight. That would be unethical, that is outside of my area of expertise. Right? My communication with you is never about digesting 7 articles and then repurposing them in a few sentences aimed at you. That's just not how I operate. So, I mean, we need a Wikipedia level of factual orientation, so that I think we can do, and I'm going to give some bigger frames. So, protests start at the end of 2025 in the bazaars of Tehran, triggered in the last instance by economic grievances about austerity measures, but really with a thicket of grievance upon grievance upon grievance building up. And the protests have rapidly pluralized themselves and spread across the different provinces of the country. They're democratically diverse. They are in part violent, but nothing compared with the violent response of the regime. Whatever figures of devastation the regime is admitting to, they're likely to be much greater. And this is happening against the background of a regime that is not, as far as we can tell, on the verge of collapse, but it is a regime that's run out of capacity in several dimensions. First, it has very limited capacity to actually practically address whatever grievances might be addressable within the structure of the regime, economic grievances, for instance. But also, the regime's narrative tools are weaker than they used to be. It's less effective for the regime to now say protests are a projection of Western imperial power. It's less effective for the regime to now say this is going to be upheaval that makes things worse rather than better. It's less effective for the regime to now say there is absolutely nobody who's leading any of this. These are sort of aimless, politically disoriented protests that couldn't possibly achieve anything. So the regime's narrative box is depleted, and the regime's practical solution box is depleted. Now, it doesn't follow from this that the regime is on the verge of collapse. When we think about this, it's very important to generally make several distinctions. You can decapitate the regime without eliminating it, which is what we've seen in Venezuela. So you can take the top of the regime off without removing the regime. Sometimes that's impossible, sometimes that's possible. Next, you can sometimes remove the regime without collapsing the state, and sometimes you can't. Now, the way this applies in Iran should be something that you get guided around by country experts. I'm not going to do that for you. Obviously, there are some very clear differences between Iran and Venezuela. You cannot, with the same ease, take off the top of the regime and keep the rest of the regime. But it's important that you, in general, understand these basic differences, because they're ubiquitous, right? They're part of a conversation we have about any regime that gets fragile. Something else that's also conceptually important here is that it doesn't follow that a different order in Iran, of a more democratic kind, of a more militaristic kind, would be less committed to a nuclear program and great regional power status. So it's important not to have fancy thoughts about what whatever follows would look like as a foreign actor. In human terms, this is very, very moving, but also very sad. It's sad that this extraordinary ancient civilization has been stuck with such despicable politics. And resistance to it is very moving. But then it raises a practical question. Who should do what about it? And as I'm taping this, Trump's come out and said help is on the way, mysteriously. Now, of course, when it comes to strikes, the United States could target leadership personnel, or they could target concentrations of repressive state machinery. They could again target what's left of the nuclear program. But the question arises, would that weaken, or would that strengthen the regime? Right, and there aren't obvious answers here. The tendency is that the regime has been able to take advantage and create a degree of consolidation at times of Western projection of power against Iran. But demographically, what's so striking about Iran is, of course, how young a country it is, and that the very youngest generation might actually be less allergic to US imperialism than previous generations. They have a different historical memory, lots of stuff that they're not in the same way triggered by, they didn't see it. And if the projection of US imperial power happens to coincide with the destabilization of the regime, clearly it'll be easier for the youngest demographic today to welcome it than it would have been in the past. The problem, however, is that there are a lot of appeals being made to the Trump administration to do something, but they're appeals to an address that doesn't quite exist, because the United States has largely ceased to exist as a strategically coherent actor. And the problem with not being a strategically coherent actor is that if you happen to do something that's constructive in a particular context, the meaning of that still depends on other things you do in other contexts. And doing a constructive thing out of all contexts is, in a sense, a kind of impossibility. And so the kind of constructive projection of US power that people are advocating for now is actually a request for something that is no longer available, right? Trump's going to do something or not going to do something that serves him, right? That serves his need for theatricity and narcissistic supply. But the request that's being made of the United States by many who want an intervention is roughly structured along the lines of doing something to penetrate the internet blackout, doing something that is very targeted, that isn't aimed against the country as a whole, but is aimed against the regime, and then keeping Israel out of it. Because Israel's involvement still is a very powerful card that the regime can use in its defense. Blaming and distracting by pointing to Israeli aggression. It's very important that you don't engage with this problem, with this development, in a navel-gazing way that's based on your own little culture wars. And I can see some of the less refined left doing that. In other words, look at the extraordinary political turmoil in Iran, look at how folks are rising up, and the answer comes back, no, Israeli ethnic cleansing and mass slaughter and American calamitous imperialism in the Middle East. There might be a lot of truth in both of these observations, but the trouble is they decenter the agency of Iranians. So that's just one way in which you can sort of fall into what we're all at risk of being guilty of. This happens constantly with Ukraine, right? Positions on Ukraine are largely a product of domestic culture wars, unfortunately, rather than considerations of European security and so on. So don't do that. Don't read it off your domestic politics. Well, why don't we stop here? And the chances are we'll end up talking about this again very soon. Lots of love for now, and probably catch you tomorrow.